Privacy matters because we all need a margin of discretion around our lives so that we can exercise some control over them. The fact of the matter is that we've already long ago given up much of our privacy as soon as we started to email and use mobile telephones. But if you thought about what it would be like if your neighbours knew details of your bank account or your medical record or could listen into your quarrels with your spouse, you would be very disconcerted because you would feel that you were losing control over areas of your life that just belong to you. That's why privacy really matters. And the great worry that we have in the digital age is that we've already given so much of it up, both to private agencies and to public ones.
Thank you. How might we give up personal information online?
Every single time we go online, every time we look at a website, every time we send an email message, every time we make a phone call with our mobile telephones, we're exposing ourselves, we're stripping ourselves naked to the view of anybody who is interested to find out what we're doing. We know already that private agencies are keen to look at the pattern of use of the internet that we indulge in so that they can target advertising at us. And governments in the Western world, indeed in the world at large, are anxious to keep a record of who people are talking to, what kind of information they're finding out, so that they can detect patterns of, that suggest crime or terrorism in the offing. And in all these ways, therefore, we expose ourselves to view through the use of these devices. Not that we would want to give up using these devices, they're just so useful to us, but they do expose us to scrutiny.
Are people aware of what they're trading when they contribute to the Google machine?
I think people are, whether explicitly or implicitly, pretty aware of what the trade-off is, and I don't think that's explicit. I don't think that's necessarily just for Google. I think as we go online, the deal is relatively straightforward. So when you go on Amazon and you click, and as you click through from product to product to product, you start to see the recommendations appear, either based on your past history or more typically your session. As you start looking for cameras, you start to see people who looked at this also looked at that. People who bought this, people who clicked at this bought that. In the course of your clicking, the service becomes more useful to you. The implicit, and for many people the explicit trade-off is that in exchange for watching over your shoulder as you shop, we will help you shop better.
Sherry, how is this generation different in terms of how much we give to other people in terms of our information?
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. I did an interview with a 16-year-old that is precious to me because he talked about how he knows that people can read his email. He knows that people, somehow he senses that his texts are being saved in some server in the sky. But when he wants to have a private conversation, he goes to payphones. And he feels that payphones are the only safe place for him to talk. I mean, you have this sense of even young people looking for the interstices of the system to find a little privacy. I don't think this is good. I think that my grandmother, who came from a European background, taught me how to be a citizen at mailboxes in New York City, where she brought me down to the mailboxes. She said, unlike in Europe, where bad governments would read your mail and open your mail, in America, it's a federal offense. She's saying it's a federal offense to read somebody else's mail. And that's what makes this country great. That kind of privacy is what gives you rights as a citizen. So in a way, I learned to be a civil libertarian. I learned to be an American at these mailboxes as a kid. I don't know where to take my daughter to teach her that. When we go through the Mass Pike and there's Easy Pass, my car is tracked, there are surveillance cameras all over. We're both giving up unprecedented amounts of information in profiling. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy?
Most people are unaware of how exposed they've made themselves. You talk to young people, for example, who've got their own personal blog sites or their presence on YouTube or Facebook, and that they may come to regret doing some of the things they did on video on the internet, or saying the things that they did, especially when they start applying for jobs and employers begin to look back through the digital record of these people, the trace that they've left in the public domain. But quite unaware, every single day that we do something digital, we are potentially leaving a trace out there, and that if somebody wanted to find out where we were shopping, what we were doing, who we were communicating with, why we were doing it, what websites we were logging onto, they could do it. It's a very, very exposed set of media, these electronic communication devices that we now use. And the point is that they're fantastically convenient. None of us would willingly give them up. But what we would want, if we really thought carefully about what it meant whenever we use these devices, we would want much, much greater individual security for our communications.
How might we give up kind of personal information using a website?
Well, one way in which you'll give up personal information is obviously by clicking on one thing or another that reveals the sorts of things you're interested in. But how would they get from that to actually figuring out, for instance, who you are? Well, it's well known in the privacy world that things like your birth date, your gender, and your postal code or zip code will allow people to figure out who you actually are, what your true name is. Now, how might a website get that information from you? Well, let's say you want to sign up for a horoscope. Then you're going to give them your birth date and probably tell them whether or not you're a man or a woman. Then maybe you want to find out what your local weather is. Probably the easiest way to do that is to put in your postal code or zip code. And bingo, they've got 3 pieces of information that are going to make it really easy for them to figure out exactly who you are.
And how do they actually do that? Do they can use that to cross-reference to a census, or how does that work?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's an enormous amount of public record data that's available about people. And so in the United States, for instance, there are lots and lots of records. Some of these are voting rolls, other kinds of public records that will contain people's true name and address and gender. So what they can do is they can figure out by cross-linking those records with the information they have and say, oh, well, this is the only person in this postal code who is of that age and of that gender. And that way they will be able to figure out who you are.
Do you think, is personal information more valuable than cash on the web?
It's hard to say just how valuable personal information on the web is. I think that most companies would rather have cash to start with, but the information is coming to them almost for free. That is, your clickstream data just comes to the website, comes to advertisers without your actually having to do anything other than just going and clicking on things. So it's a very, very cheap and unobtrusive form of currency. I mean, probably the best thing about it is that it is so unobtrusive. You don't know you're giving it up, and so it seems entirely free to you. And then the consequences of it, maybe you get certain kinds of ads, maybe you get telephone solicitations, but you have no way of knowing that that's because you clicked on 17 things on these 5 websites, and so whatever it is that you're paying for it, you don't really make a connection to the information you're giving up. And I think, frankly, people see cash, individuals see cash differently because it's something that comes straight out of their pocket. the information they give up, they don't see it leaving, and they don't know what anyone's doing with it.
What is the greatest threat to privacy online, and what can be done to protect it?
Well, there are a variety of threats to privacy online. The worst case scenario would be when information about a person is collected by a large, powerful institution, whether public or private, whether government or corporate, in a way that is used profoundly to their disadvantage, and where the individual has no control over the usage of that information. So it could be to conduct surveillance on people, and in fact, it is so much easier now to collect so much more information about what people do, what they read, what they see, what they buy, that in the hands of a government that has no respect for civil liberties, if you can imagine the sort of post-9/11 world run amok, there's an enormous threat that it would be used to silence political opposition and political opponents and enforce a kind of authoritarian regime. That's the scenario I worry about.
What happens when you go online? I mean, what goes on?
The moment you go online, you are recorded as having gone online. You leave a print. People know roughly where you're coming from, and they know you've entered a site. And once you've entered that site, it can say where you're going in that site, where you don't go in that site, what you look at, what you don't look at, what search terms that you use, what documents you decide to display, and how long you're there, and where you go next. And by putting all those things together, we can begin to develop characteristics of information-seeking behavior and use in cyberspace. It's very, very simple, and it's done automatically, which is the beauty. And anybody could do it, essentially. But don't.